Let's bring in our chief foreign correspondent, Trey Yingster, chief national security correspondent, Jennifer Griffin, and senior correspondent Benjamin Hall for more. Trey, where do you think we are in terms of acceptance of this 21-point plan on Israel's side and then Hamas's side?
John, all indications in the region are that we are very close to an agreement to end the war inside Gaza. Next week will mark 2 years since the October 7th massacre, and we have gotten a look at some of the details inside of this 21-point plan. The plan says that within 48 hours of Israel accepting the agreement, all of the remaining hostages, 48 of them, 20 who are believed to be alive, would be freed from Hamas captivity inside the Gaza Strip, at which point Israel would be required to give up hundreds of life-sentenced Palestinian prisoners, some of them convicted of terrorism charges, along with around 1,000 Palestinians from Gaza who have been arrested since the beginning of the war. As part of this agreement, more aid would also flow into the Gaza Strip. You'd also see a gradual withdrawal of Israeli forces from the enclave, and then an ushering in of a technocratic government that would at least temporarily take over control of pockets of Gaza before it could be stabilized and a rebuilding effort started. All of this hinges, though, on whether or not Hamas will agree to this deal. And it will be interesting to see what President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu come out and say during this press conference at the White House, because unless they have assurances from the Qataris and from other regional players that Hamas is willing to accept this agreement, these two world leaders could come out and say that a deal has been reached. But again, this all hinges on whether or not Hamas will lay down their weapons and release the hostages. John, Jillian?
And thanks for that, Trey. If history, recent and ancient, is any guide, Benjamin, there is zero chance Hamas is going to do that. They have spent the last few decades clinging to political power at any and every expense. They have not blinked when tens of thousands of people die, their own people, Palestinians in Gaza. They have not blinked as this war has unfolded and 2 million people have been displaced. It is hard to imagine they're going to get to some point where they willingly, pass the baton on to new leadership.
Well, absolutely. And I think that any deal that comes to them, and Hamas has just said yesterday that they have not yet seen any sort of new negotiation, any sort of plan. So this has not yet reached Hamas officially. And they said they will only listen and respond to something that came from one of their trusted mediators. So again, Qatar or the UAE. But so I think whatever goes to them has to be watertight, because if they commit to give up all the hostages dead and alive in 48 hours, they are effectively giving up. And I hate to use the word, they're bargaining chips. That's how they see these hostages who they've held for almost 2 years as bargaining chips. And if they give them their freedom and they hand them back to Israel, then I suppose Hamas will be worried and thinking, then we've got nothing left, and Israel looks for one way in which they say we've broken the deal and the war continues and we've lost the hostages, which they can keep using. So can Hamas give them up? We know that Hamas does not mind the death of civilians. I mean, the more people that die, the more Hamas seem to feel that they get political gains. And look, you can just see how all these countries recently said they would recognize a Palestinian state. The UK, Canada, Australia, France. President Trump himself, when he was here visiting Windsor, said that is effectively a victory to Hamas. They have killed 1,200 people, they have taken all these hostages, and they are getting something positive from it. Irrespective of the fact that Gaza has been flattened in many parts, 60,000 people there have been killed, according to the Gazan authorities, to Hamas. So what can you say to Hamas? How can you guarantee to them that if they release the hostages, that this peace deal will go forward? And I think that that's going to be the one thing which will decide whether they accept it or not.
Jennifer, I was just thinking this morning, how long have we been at this? I remember the heady days back in 1993 when on September the 13th, Bill Clinton presided over that famous handshake between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat. And everybody thought, well, it's peace in our time. And while the faces and the players may have changed, we're not far from where we were back then.
Absolutely, John. In fact, I can remember when I arrived in Israel in 1999, that was at the tail end of the Oslo Peace Accords. We didn't know it at the time, but the Intifada, the second Intifada that broke out the following year, that pretty much put a nail in those peace accords, and a Palestinian state has been elusive ever since. And 7.5 years later of war in Gaza and then the West Bank and inside Israel did not deliver a Palestinian state. I think what is notable is that unlike any time that I've ever seen a U.S. president bring an Israeli prime minister into the White House, Prime Minister Netanyahu is under a tremendous amount of pressure, both domestically but also by President Trump, who has a great deal of leverage over Prime Minister Netanyahu and Israel because of what a good friend he has been up until this point. And I think it is notable that Prime Minister Netanyahu had to call from the White House under President Trump's direction and apologize to the Qatari leadership for that airstrike that killed that was targeting Hamas, missed, but killed a Qatari security officer. That apology seems to be laying the groundwork for perhaps Qatar coming back on board, and Qatar will have the most influence. If anyone has an influence over Hamas, it is Qatar. And that airstrike was very disruptive and surprised the White House and angered the president and others, and had really set back what Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner had been trying to negotiate in the region.
Panel, I'm going to go ahead and bring in Nathan Sales. Stick with us because we'll be right back to you. Ambassador Nathan Sales, kindly sitting with us on the set here. Sir, what would you most like to see? Forget, the niceties and what they might say about a deal. What would you like to see concretely come out of this meeting?
Great question, Julia. The basic structure of the deal, we can talk about the details, but the basic structure is the war ends on the one hand, and on the other hand, Hamas releases all the hostages, and it does it now, and Hamas goes into exile, playing no future role in the governance of Gaza. Now, the key question is, Israel seems to be prepared to say yes, more or less, to everything that the president has put on the table. The Arab states in the region, likewise, are prepared to say yes to basically everything the president has put on the table. The key question, and you guys teed this up, where's Hamas on all this? And let's be clear, terrorist groups like Hamas don't have the best track record of negotiating in good faith or keeping their promises. So that's really what I'm watching for. How does Hamas respond to its increasing isolation on the world stage as some of its protectors and benefactors start to squeeze it to try and get them to say yes?
So what's the incentive for Hamas to lay down their arms and give up and either go into exile or, as the Israelis have talked about under this 21-point plan, live peacefully in Gaza as long as they renounce violence against the Jewish state? I mean, really, what's in it for them? Because if they lose control of Gaza, they've lost everything that they've ever fought for.
Right. So I think the leverage that we have over Hamas, forget about the risk of destruction in Gaza. Hamas doesn't care. In fact, the destruction of Gaza perversely actually advances Hamas's strategic objectives because they can use the consequences of the war they started to apply pressure to Israel. But what does Hamas care about? It cares ultimately, I think, about some kind of statehood for the Palestinian people. Now, they want one state solution, not a two-state solution. This is why I think the president's promise to the Arab states that he will not let Israel annex parts of Gaza or parts of the West Bank could be pivotal going forward. That's something Hamas may care about. Is it enough to guarantee that they'll play ball and come to the table and negotiate in good faith? I don't know, but that's the sort of thing that I could see maybe moving the needle a little bit with these guys.
This is interesting. Just into the newsroom, the White House has released what they are calling President Donald J. Trump's comprehensive plan to end the Gaza conflict. Now, we do not know whether the 20 or 21 points, 20 points listed in this peace plan have been agreed to yet by Bibi Netanyahu. They're still in their meeting. We're awaiting them coming out at the White House. But, Mr. Ambassador, the top here, the first point is that Gaza will be a de-radicalized, terror-free zone that does not pose a threat to its neighbors. Point two is Gaza will be redeveloped for the benefit of the people of Gaza who have suffered more than enough. This gets us to a point that Jennifer Griffin brought up last hour, which is the idea that some kind of multinational transitional peacekeeping force takes hold in Gaza. Those kinds of peacekeeping forces historically have not worked out so well. Yeah,
the United Nations doesn't have the best track record keeping the peace in Lebanon. in other parts of the world that have been
All
hotspots.
over Africa.
All
Yeah,
over
yeah.
Africa, right? So it's a really short list of success stories, really short. So we're going to have to improvise here. We're going to have to rely on President Trump's personal relationships with Gulf leaders, whether that's the Saudis or the Emiratis or the Qataris, and hopefully, or the Egyptians, and hopefully we can see a regional coalition of forces on the ground there. We don't want the Israelis to do it because that's a recipe for occupation and continued conflict. The Arab states won't like that. So the Arab states, if they don't want the Israelis to be guaranteeing security, they're going to have to step up and provide security themselves.
All right, let's go back to Trey Yingst in Israel because he's had a chance to look through this now 20-point plan, as Jillian pointed out. We thought it was 21, but they've either amalgamated two into one or they decided that they didn't need one. But the part of this that I thought was interesting, Trey, is point number 3. It says if both sides agree to this proposal, the war will immediately end. That's a big if.
Yeah, John, absolutely. And what does this tell us? The White House releasing more details to this plan. It means over the past 48 hours, they have been going through these individual points and negotiating, and they are getting closer to what will be the framework of this proposal. And when you look through it, there are a few numbers slightly changed, such as the release of the hostages. The new point number 4 says within 72 hours of Israel publicly accepting the agreement, all hostages alive and deceased will be returned. Also, we have more numbers of what the Israelis will have to give up. This plan states that 250 life sentence Palestinian prisoners plus 1,700 Gazans who were detained after October 7th would be freed. When you go through this, I also look at point number 10, which also stands out to me, and it says a, quote, Trump economic development plan to rebuild and energize Gaza will be created by convening a panel of experts who have helped birth some of the thriving modern miracle cities in the Middle East. This language sounds like it is coming directly from the White House. And again, the president's name is on this plan. He is directly involved in trying to get this ceasefire agreement over the finish line to end the war inside Gaza nearly 2 years in, return those hostages, and finally bring this situation in the Middle East that's been going on for 724 days to a close. John, Jillian?
Thanks for that, Trey. Jennifer, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at any of these yet, but to pick up on a point that Trey just made, what does a quote-unquote end, sudden terminal end to this war look like? And at this point, is it even possible when you have two sides who have not really acknowledged getting involved in a war in the first place?
Well, I think what's notable, Jillian, is a talk of an end to the war suggests that there are two parties involved. But if you look at the Gaza Strip and you look at Hamas and other allied terrorist organizations, whether it's Islamic Jihad or many, many splinter groups that, remember, the hostages who were taken on October 7th, they were sent to be held by these different groups. What is Islamic Jihad saying about this? What are the other groups saying? What is the Palestinian Authority saying? A lot of this sounds like it's being negotiated between the President Trump, and the Prime Minister of Israel. While the Qataris and other Arab states want to be involved, it is not clear that this is a cohesive group on the other side in the Palestinian. One of the problems with the last 20 years or so is that the Israelis have pretty much eliminated a lot of the leadership of the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority itself is disrespected because of the corruption, and so they don't have authority. So the question is, who speaks for the Palestinians? And there is not one person to negotiate with. So you can declare an end to the war, but what happens with all the weapons in Gaza? What happens? How do you do this transfer? How is it that the leaders of Hamas, if they survive in the next 72 hours, are they going to be ferried out of Gaza and to a safe country? They weren't safe in Qatar, as we saw just a few weeks ago. So there may be an agreement, but I just don't see how it's implemented.
So to that point, Jennifer, number 6 in this peace plan says that Hamas members who commit to peaceful coexistence and to decommission their weapons will be given amnesty. They will also be provided safe passage to receiving countries. But it would not be entirely impossible for the group to reconstitute elsewhere. I cannot imagine that the foreign funds, from state sponsors of terrorism around the world would completely dry up, in 24 hours.
I think it's less likely that they could reconstitute elsewhere, because we did see this again at the end of the Second Intifada. And remember, there was a big siege in Bethlehem at the Church of the Nativity, and some of those Palestinian Authority members of the Al-Aqsa Brigades were sent as part of the amnesty to Ireland and elsewhere. And they did stop fighting. They integrated into European countries, and they have not carried out attacks on Israel since then. However, what is more likely to happen is that people inside Gaza who might be affiliated with Hamas, either loosely or directly, they might put down their weapons temporarily. They may change they don't wear uniforms, but they may try to blend back into the population and not leave. Those are the people who usually are the seeds of the next intifada, the next attempt to attack Israel. That desire to destroy Israel has not been negotiated away based on this 20-point plan, and it is unclear who speaks for the Hamas. Most of the Hamas leaders have been killed at this point. Who speaks for them, and how much control do they have over their followers and the other followers, as I mentioned, in Islamic Jihad and other groups who have vowed to fight Israel to the death?
So as we go through this, and let's go to Benjamin Hall, point number 15 here. Benji, it says the United States will work with Arab and international partners to develop a temporary international stabilization force to immediately deploy in Gaza. That ISF will train and provide support to vetted Palestinian police forces in Gaza and will consult with Jordan and Egypt. It'll be a long-term internal security solution. It goes on to say, in the event that Hamas delays or rejects this proposal, the above, including a scaled-up aid operation, will proceed in the terror-free areas handed over from the IDF to the ISF. So what they're saying here is either Hamas agrees to this, or we're going to start reforming what they're now calling New Gaza right around you.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
What do you think Hamas's reaction to that would be?
No, it is fascinating. And again, it comes back to that idea that many of the few groups that Hamas will listen to are named in this 20-point plan. And you ask who would be peacekeepers in Gaza once Hamas leave. And you have to imagine that Israel does not want sort of Arab peacekeepers right inside effectively Israel. So what they are doing here is that they are saying that these other countries, for example, in this case, number 15, they talk about Jordan, they talk about Egypt, who will be helping to train up this international stabilization force. And once they're trained up, those will be Palestinian police forces. So it's interesting to see they're already looking as to how they can set up sort of non-Hamas, non-terror-linked Palestinian groups without allowing perhaps Arab groups to come in and play a big military role inside Gaza. So it's fascinating to see the different countries that are involved with this, and you can't help but think that maybe a positive for Israel is an extension of the Abraham Accords and building on the relationship in the region. That's something President Trump has talked about for a very long time. If you can stop the war in Gaza, you can really start rebuilding the Abraham Accords, phase number 2. And that leads to real economic success across the whole region. And I think that you talk about Trump's economic plan and talking about the rebuilding and the property. This has President Trump's ideas behind it, and they've laid out a way in which that may be able to happen. So look, this is somewhat military. It's setting up a new police force. It's looking at Palestinian role. It's trying to get the terrorists out. And it's looking at maybe making Gaza, rebuilding it and trying to make it prosperous in the future. So look, it is looking somewhat to the long distance. It's looking to the short distance. It's trying to cover quite a lot of points. And again, it only takes 1 point for one of these groups, for Hamas or Israel, to disagree with. And it's largely thought that Israel has agreed with most points, and there were two major points that they disagree with. One is the Palestinian Authority having a role, and the other is a path to statehood. But President Trump has come out and said both sides need to make some concessions. Are those the two concessions? What concessions does Hamas have to make? But it's a really detailed 20-point plan, this, and we'd have to wait to see what happens.
And just to add to the point that you were making, Benji, about expansion of the Abraham Accords, as we saw at the UN General Assembly on Friday during his speech, Benjamin Netanyahu suggested that Israel is well into negotiations with the new Syrian government about a security plan. not yet a normalization of relations, but a security plan. And he reached out to Lebanon to say, hey, let's get rid of Hezbollah and see if we can normalize relations between the two countries. But all of that hinges, I think, on stopping this war in Gaza. Jillian?
Oh, go ahead, Benji.
No, I was also going to say it's quite interesting to hear Prime Minister Netanyahu on Sunday talk about the enriched uranium that Iran is still holding, the tons of it that it's still holding. And I can't help but think whether or not, Iran may play some part in this, and whether or not Israel still has an idea that if it ends the war in Gaza, whereas it still feels it has unfinished business inside Iran, and if that could play a role in the future.
Hey, it's Will Kane. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Kane podcast for full episodes right now.